Oh, great! Last year I only left 3 cosplays unfinished. That's pretty good on average, right? We do not talk about these cosplays. Welcome to Cosplayland! I am Alice and today I am finishing a project that I started last year and it is Ganyu from Genshin Impact. If you saw my last video, and I don't blame you if you didn't because it was stupidly long, you will know that I am now a full-time content creator, which means I get to be in my pajamas all day, but you know, I made an effort and just put on a t-shirt for you today, guys. Anyway, what I'm going to be doing is just finishing this cosplay that I left unfinished last time because honestly this was like about a year ago almost, like it was February, March when I started with Ganyu. I was very hyped with the character, it was super cool, but unfortunately it was not going right. I just made the full pattern for everything and it did not fit, and everything I made just I had to do a million times because it was not working, and in the end I just decided to just leave it. And to be honest, at the time, it's not that I just left this cosplay, I left everything, literally. I think I did not do a cosplay for several months and just like stopped for a bit because it was like very awful to be on social media at the time and I just didn't feel like it. But all that is over and I asked on my Instagram, and you should follow me with there if you are not following me. I asked which cosplay would you like me to do first for this year, and one of the options was Ganyu, which was something I had already started and I knew there were people that really wanted me to finish and see the final dress. So that was the winner by far and that's what we are going to be doing. I still think it's very crazy because it's a very difficult cosplay with lots of parts and drawings and everything, but I'm gonna try my best and hopefully this time I'm gonna have this done in a month. Like, hopefully, I hope that. To be honest, I am already late. I just expected to finish the whole painting part this first week of building, but I'm a little bit behind because it's not easy. Definitely there are a few things that I could have done differently and I will tell you which ones during the video, but yeah, I did it to the best of my abilities right now and I'm sure I'm gonna improve a lot for next build. So let's say this cosplay is more of a trial and error kind of thing, like any other cosplay I make, I guess. But yeah, this is what I did to make all the painted parts and all the pattern for everything on Ganyu. Hope you like it, let's go to the video! As I said, I started with the pattern for this cosplay and it was a little bit difficult to make. As you can imagine, it has lots of pieces here and there, and what I basically did was I traced the pattern from the original pictures from the game. Now, unfortunately, I am not the same build as Ganyu, which is not real, sorry guys, so I had to adapt quite a few things and it took me about 3 mock-ups before I got to the pattern that I wanted. It may come as a surprise to you, but I actually use mostly fabric from my stash when I build this cosplay, as it's mostly white and I had a lot of white fabric laying around from other cosplays, including some extra fabric that I bought for Lisa, which I haven't done either. And yeah, my cat Melina just helped me with the cosplay selection of fabric as usual. She's so adorable. I actually used lining fabric for some pieces that were quite big, but I wanted them to be slightly see-through because that way it would be easier to see the pattern underneath, and also because they are cheaper, and I was hoping that because they are see-through I will be able to paint one side and it will be visible enough from the other side. Just in case, I was going to dye my fabric slightly blue at the bottom, and I did so, but unfortunately it didn't go so well, and even if it took me like several hours of dyeing because I didn't follow the instructions very well, and basically it did not work. I must say my fabric was very polyester, and even if you can dye polyester fabric with the right thing, you need a lot of extra color for it, and I definitely did not use it. Have you noticed the cat just appearing every so often in my footage? Like, honestly, like she's always there, every single time. You put fabric on the floor, she gets on it. As usual, I just put some weights on top of my patterns and I put them on the fold in order to cut them. Feel free to use a cat. In this particular case, I don't really need to leave seam allowance on the edges, but I will leave some seam allowance at the back of the tail because I'm just going to turn them and top stitch it. The rest is going to be hidden by the vinyl on top, so I'm not concerned about leaving any seam allowance. However, do be careful because the right side and the left side are different and I actually cut them the wrong way around, so the actual pattern is for the right side, so it needs to be put the other way around if you are using the back side of your fabric, otherwise you will end up with the pieces on the wrong side, if that makes sense. Originally, I was going to use a stencil for all the pattern that I'm going to be airbrushing, and what I did was to trace my pattern on some sticky plastic that you would use to cover a book. It's very cheap, it's very easy to find, and it is quite effective. First, I trace the pattern and later on I'm gonna put it underneath this sticky paper so I can see all the lines and I'm just going to draw every single line of them. I'm just going to explain you more or less how this is supposed to work. Basically, the top part, which is the white, is the original fabric, so you want to mask that part so it doesn't get any stains. Then you want to go to colors every time a little bit darker, so you're going to have a very light color at the top, and then the next color is going to be a bit darker, there's going to be a third color, a fourth color, and there's in total 5 colors for this project. And that can be like a little bit daunting, but it's actually not so difficult because you can actually just choose 2 or 3 colors and keep adding more of the darker color to your lighter color. You will see that later. Oh look, a cat! You know what that means, right? Yeah, I put my fabric on the floor, yet again. If you are going to be using paint, I would suggest to protect any surfaces with some cardboard or paper, even wrapping paper would do. For the bigger parts, I decided to use masking tape because that will stick enough to your fabric so the paint doesn't go through and it will just be enough to hold it in place. Originally, I wasn't paying much attention to the ends of my masking tape and I was just cutting them with my fingers, and that turned out to be a big mistake because the actual masking tape was sticking a lot to my fabric, and when I tried to cut those edges, I kind of cut my fabric as well. So if you notice a little hole on my skirt, that's why. So later I changed the method, and what I did is I used scissors to cut every single piece of tape, which did take forever but was totally worth it because I was able to control the edges of those masking tape's corners, and it became much cleaner and much easier to just have those clean edges at the bottom. And yes, I did use my stencil as well, but unfortunately with every single layer it was kind of hard to see where the lines were going and it needed to be very exact, so I had to change to the masking tape method. That takes much longer, and yeah, that's why you will see me changing both approaches. Sometimes I'll use masking tape and sometimes I will use this sticky paper. I'm actually not a fan of airbrushes, not because I don't think they are useful, but because they are a pain to clean and to mix and to find the right consistency for your paint. So this is basically what I was doing. I was putting a little bit of the paint that I was going to be using. Sometimes I will put a drop of the darker paint if I wanted the paint to be a bit darker. And then you can't use your paint straight from the bottle, so you are going to be needing to use airbrush thinner and a little bit of flow improver if you want to be a little bit fancy with it. Now, I can't tell you the exact amount because I basically just did it so it was enough to go through my airbrush, but it was a little bit like about half of airbrush thinner and half of paint. You want to mix your paint very well, and I also suggest to make a test before you start. And when I say before you start, it's every time you mix your paint. You want to make sure that your paint is going through the airbrush, otherwise you're going to end up with spots, splatters, or simply a mess, because if it's too watery it's going to go through your fabric, and if it's too thick it's basically not going to go through the machine at all. So you want to test every single time before you start painting. And don't forget to use your mask and some gloves. If not, you probably will end up with blue buggies like I did because I forgot it. Let's start airbrushing. As you can see, I first tested my paint to make sure it's thin enough to go through my airbrush, and then I could just slightly start painting my fabric, and I'm going to go from the lightest color to the darker color. This makes sense because you can always hide a darker color, but it's very difficult to do it the other way around. You will need a lot of paint, and definitely it's something you don't want to do with your airbrush because the layer of paint is going to be very thin. I'm also using my stencil underneath just to have a rough idea of how far I need to go with the color and make sure I'm covering all the areas that I need to be covered. Once it was all airbrushed, what I want to do is just wait for this layer of paint to dry. You can use a hairdryer if you want, but be very careful because there could be puddles on top of your shiny plastic, and you want to avoid moving any of that paint because it can stain the rest of your fabric. And of course, your fabric could warp, and if you get the wet paint touching an area that you don't want to, you will get it stained. Oh yeah, totally like this. That's what you want to avoid. If you notice, I taped the rest of the fabric, but I didn't tape the bottom part, and yeah, well, that happens. Once I finished with the first row, I started masking the second one, and I made sure to cover all the gaps to the top of my previous layer to make sure I'm not spilling any of that paint on any corners. So make sure you are masking more than you need to, because definitely just the masking tape width is not enough to cover it, and your airbrush is perhaps going to stain the rest. Oh, and be careful with your airbrush because, you know, if you fill it too much, you can just definitely just stain your fabric, and just those drops will show and it will go underneath your fabric and you'll have to clean it. And you see my point of why I don't like airbrushes at all? You see it? Yeah? Well, let's go on. This is the color number 3. And this is the 4th one. And yep, I spilled my paint again. I was very lucky because I was trying to just use the airbrush, just making sure my airbrush was on top of the taped part, suppose as how I was doing it before, because if the paint like here falls, it will fall on the tape, the masked part, instead of your fabric, and if you are quick enough, you won't stain your fabric. Once all my pieces were painted and they were dry, I was able to take the masking tape on one go. It's quite satisfying, and it's also very scary because it's very easy to get some stains or get your fabric bleeding, and you know, it could not be perfect, but it actually worked quite well, so I was very happy when it came off completely and I could see the different patterns and the different colors on it. You can see that some pieces looked better than others, and I definitely stained this piece. I totally forgot, or rather I didn't think I needed to tape the top completely, and what happened was that the airbrush, being an airbrush, just spilled some paint in the air and it got to the white part, and you can see a little bit of a stain at the top because of that. So I would suggest trying to airbrush against the white part, so you want to be facing away from the white part. That way the airbrush flow will go the opposite direction, and hopefully you won't get these stains like I did. But the best thing to do is basically just to put something on top of any single part that you need to keep the original color. I could have used the same method for all the parts, but I decided to use a normal brush to make the smaller pieces. I'm not sure if it was the right decision, but after 4 or 5 hours just non-stop airbrushing, I just didn't want to know anything about airbrushes for quite a bit, so I decided to just use some brushes to do the smallest parts. And this was the final result. It's not completely clean, it could have been much better, but I think in general it's actually quite good, and if you look at it from, half a meter, it's gonna look awesome, so I'm happy with it. Definitely I could have gone for a second coat in all those paints, but I did not have enough paint to go for a second coat, so I couldn't even do it. So this is what's going to look like. I'm especially happy with the front part, which is the one that's going to be seen the most, so that's gonna be good. Obviously can't really wear this part just yet, but hopefully I will be sewing all these parts together next week, so just make sure to come back to see how my cats just play on top of my fabrics again, and make sure to subscribe if you want to see the rest of this project. See you next time, bye! Honestly, there wasn't a better space to just fall asleep. It had to be on top of my just painted fabric, right? These cats are gonna kill me. Me?